Just let me say what the main theme of what I'm going to say today is. I'm going to talk about the notion of representation, which is a very common concept in cultural studies and in media studies kinds of work. But I want to explore the idea a little bit, and I want to try and say something about how I understand representation working and why it's a more difficult and more complex subject than it appears to begin with. I'm talking about largely visual representation, or the examples I'm going to try to cite are from visual representation, but I think what I'm going to say has a bearing on the practices of representation in general. I choose visual representation because it's a kind of cliche to say that in the modern world, our culture is saturated by the image in a variety of different forms. The image itself, whether moving or still, and whether transmitted by a variety of different media, seems to have become the privileged sign of late modern culture. And late modern culture is not only that culture which one finds in the advanced industrial, post-industrial societies of the Western world, but because of the global explosion in communication systems, it is also the saturating medium, the saturating idiom of communication worldwide. So I think to try and take the idea of representation to the image is an important question. And cultural studies has paid a tremendous amount of attention in one way or another to the centrality of representations and of the practice of representation. And media studies itself is, in an obvious sense, concerned in part with the variety of different texts, in my instance, visual texts, representations, which are transmitted by the media. But I'm going to stand back from that a bit to begin with and try and look at the process of representation itself. Now, the word has a kind of double meaning, even in its common sense, understanding. It does mean to present, to image, to depict, to offer a depiction of something else. And the word representation or representation does sort of carry with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. Nevertheless, this notion that somehow representation represents a meaning which is already there is a very common idea, and on the other hand, one of the ideas that I'm going to try to subvert. So I give you the common sense meaning to try to take it back a little bit in what I'm going to say. But then there's another understanding of the word representation, which also plays a role in what we bring to this topic, because we speak of political figures as representing us in some way. We don't probably say that very often these days because we may not think they represent us very well, but they're sort of supposed to represent us, and in that sense, they stand in for us. They are our representatives. Where we can't be, they can be. So the notion of something which images and depicts and that which stands in for something else, both of those ideas are kind of brought together in the notion of representation. Now, what this idea that media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations, what we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about. And if you think that the meaning that it is giving is very different from or a kind of distortion of what it really means, then your work on representation would be in measuring that gap between what one might think of as the true meaning of an event or an object and how it is presented in the media. And there's a lot of very good work which is in media studies, which is exactly like this. I think the truth is that in cultural studies now, and in a great deal of media studies work, that notion of representation is regarded as too literal and too straightforward. And the reason for that is because we want to ask the question of whether events, the meaning of people, groups, what they're doing, etc., whether these things do have any one essential, fixed, or true meaning against which we could measure, as it were, the level of distortion in the way in which they're represented. Suppose one says, yes, I can see that people are meeting now in Northern Ireland to discuss the Northern Ireland situation. But what it means, what is the meaning of that meeting, is a very complicated thing to decide. You'd have to know not only the whole history of what led up to it, you'd have to know what each of the participants wants out of it, you'd have to know some assessment of what the consequences of that event are likely to be before you could say, what is the meaning? And we all know absolutely clearly, the one thing you can be certain of is that there will never be one interpretation of what is going on in Northern Ireland today. Absolutely. It will always be a contested question. There will never be a finally settled, fixed meaning. The one thing you can say about those events is that there is no one true fixed meaning about it. Well, now, this is a different situation. In a way, what we're saying now is that representation doesn't really capture the process at all, because there was nothing absolutely fixed there in the first place to represent. Of course, there was something. People are meeting, they're talking, they're arguing with one another, they're going to take decisions, consequences will follow. So, not that nothing is happening in the world, but what is dubious is what is the true meaning of it. And the true meaning of it will depend on what meaning people make of it. And the meanings that they make of it depends on how it is represented. The meaning of an event in Northern Ireland does not exist until it has been represented. And that's a very different process. Now we're talking about representation, not as an after the event activity. It means something and then the presentation might change or distort the meaning. We're talking about the fact that it has no fixed meaning, no real meaning in the obvious sense until it has been represented. And the representation, since they're likely to be very different as you move from one person to another, one group or another, one part of society and another, one historical moment and another, just as those forms of representation will change, so the meaning of the event will change. Now, what this means is, in fact, that the process of representation has entered into the event itself. It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't exist meaningfully until it has been represented. And that, to put that in a more highfalutin way, is to say that representation doesn't occur after the event. Representation is constitutive of the event. It enters into the constitution of the object that we're talking about. It is part of the object itself. It is constitutive of it. It is one of its conditions of existence. And therefore, representation is not outside the event, not after the event, but within the event itself. It is constitutive of it.